Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Troy Fullerton from Bilingual Barrier Busters, and I wanted to talk tonight about how are we actually going to do this. As far as if you've decided that it's time to develop bilingual skills, it's time for you to learn Spanish, if that's what you're learning, then exactly how do we go about this? What are we going to do? I want to go over some common fallacies to try to help steer us in the right direction tonight. There are certain things that are just out there. It seems like everywhere you go, you run into certain ideas, and everybody's got some idea or some fad solution to the problem here of trying to develop bilingual skills. And I want to talk about some things that just don't work, and then talk about what does work and what we might do to solve that problem. So, one common fallacy that we run into is that it's possible to just pick up a language as we go along, that we don't really need any formal instruction at all. Now, if I have several years to be surrounded by a community that speaks the language I want to learn, and I'm surrounded by it all the time, and I don't have any real fear or any negative feelings, neither about myself nor towards those who speak that language, and time's not a problem, and really money's not a problem either, and I can observe and learn that way, yeah, eventually I might acquire the language, but how realistic is that? Probably not. Let's face it, we can't go back and be children again, raised in our target language home. It just doesn't work that way. We're going to have to do something else. Now, along with the way here, along with this school of thought, is the idea that we do not need to study grammar. Granted, there was a time when there was a tremendous over-reliance on grammar study, and we wound up with people who knew a lot about the grammar of their target language, but still couldn't speak it. People who had taken several years of a particular language in school, Spanish or French or what have you, and then got in an environment where it was needed, couldn't make sentences and couldn't make sense out of what was being said either. So obviously, just studying grammar alone is insufficient. However, there has been a school of thought that has arisen that all we need is what's called comprehensible input. That is, as long as we're given exposure to language that we can understand, maybe because of the context, maybe because somebody has got it across to us in some way, or we were in a program where we simply couldn't miss, why, that language was going to stick, and we were going to learn that way. Now, comprehensible input, I want to emphasize, is a very important part of language acquisition. I don't believe we can do without it. We have to be able to actually be exposed to language, and it has to be comprehensible to us in order for the language acquisition device that we all, theoretically anyway, have in our brains to process that language and bring it home to us and make it so that we can use it. But there's been a tremendous amount of spin-off from this idea of comprehensible input, and you see it in various programs out there, and I'm not going to start mentioning names. I'm sure you run into them, or you will sooner or later, where they say no need to study grammar or memorize grammar rules. All you need is to learn naturally through this comprehensible input program, whatever kind it is. There are various ones out there. Even some public schools have gone absolutely crazy with their comprehensible input format, trying to teach a language with very little grammar at all. Now, I have a question for you. Where are all of these people that have supposedly acquired a foreign language through comprehensible input and very little study of grammar. Theoretically, it's supposed to work. Where are they? We can see dozens of people who went through a program, or maybe they did it on their own, maybe they did it through school, where that's what they had was comprehensible input. And if they learned anything, a lot of times what they learn, what comes out of their mouths, I should say, is a bunch of gobbledygook that they throw together and call it communicating very ungrammatically. And this is where you get people that maybe they had fun learning the language, so to speak, but they never did get it correct either. So the point I'm making, and studies back this up, comprehensible input by itself is also insufficient. So what do we need? Well, yes, we need to study grammar, but we also need comprehensible input. We need input that we can hear and understand, and we need input that we can read and understand. In fact, reading is very beneficial to anybody studying a language, because when people can read, they can take their time. It's not threatening. If they get the right material, they can see how the language is put together, how it's used. While they're studying grammar, they can actually see the grammar is used. So we can't say enough good about plenty of reading when it comes to learning a foreign language. Whether you're studying on your own or you're in some program, you need that input, but you also need to get a good grasp of the grammar and know it's probably not going to simply come by osmosis because you were exposed to it. So something that makes reading very comprehensible, and eventually things that you hear very comprehensible as well, is learning cognates. Cognates are look-alike words. Oftentimes they come in families. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is oftentimes you will have lists of words that resemble one another, and they'll be like lists of words that resemble one another in English. Possibly think of the words in English that end with tion: nation, position, composition. Think of the words in English that end with the ity suffix: activity, identity, etc. So many times these words will be related to words in the language you're trying to learn, particularly if it is a Western language that was based on Latin, because those words came into English taking a circuitous route, but originally from Latin as well. When we learn to recognize these cognates, our vocabulary increases exponentially without ever having to really study those words. So this is something that we need to lean into, is cognates, especially if we're trying to learn a language like Spanish and we already speak English. So that is another thing that we need to use as a key here, that we need to pay attention to cognates, and particularly groups of cognates. A third thing we need to do is we need to know, how do I learn vocabulary? How do I get the words? Well, there's a principle here. We need to go from general to specific. In other words, we're going to learn to say words like tools before we learn how to say saw, hammer, drill. We're going to learn how to say birds, the most general thing, before we learn how to say sparrow, cardinal, robin. So this is a principle we need to look at, is let's go and get the most general, generic vocabulary first, and then build on it, because what we will have done is we will have given our brains a space to build a cluster of all of those related vocabulary words. Another thing we need to do is we need to realize that the verb is the very heart of the sentence, and we need to learn our verbs, but what we need to do is focus first on the most high frequency verbs in the language. You can buy books of the most frequently used verbs in a language, and then what we have to do is learn what to do with those verbs, how to put those verbs in the past, how to put those verbs in the present, in the future, etc. All kinds of things we need to learn to do with the verbs, and that brings us right back down to the study of grammar. We study grammar to learn how to fit the words together so they make sense. We also study the grammar to learn how the verbs work. So any good program is going to have elements of all of these things that I'm talking about here. And then one of the most important things you need is time. If I go to try to build a brick wall, I'm going to need to lay those blocks and let the mortar harden before I put another layer on top. And then I'm going to need to let the mortar harden again before I put another layer on top. Then I'm going to need to let that mortar harden before I put another layer on top. And you're like, Dr. Troy, what's that got to do with language study? Well, the way our brains work, we can't go too fast. We've got to have a foundation that we give ourselves a little bit of time to process before we go building something else on top of that. Now, if that doesn't make a lot of sense to you now, it will as soon as you start studying the language you're trying to acquire. One excellent way to do that is through our program at Bilingual Barrier Busters. If you go to www.bilingualbarrierbusters.com, you can learn all about our program for language study for self-studiers, a language study for those getting into a cohort with other people trying to acquire the same language, and all kinds of supports and resources available at a very inexpensive rate. Again, go to www.bilingualbarrierbusters.com and get the information. Meanwhile, keep coming back to our channel to learn more about language and language study, to get grammar tips, to ask questions and to get answers to your questions. Leave questions in the comments, and we'll try to answer every question you have. Meanwhile, leave a like, subscribe to our channel, and good luck with your language studies.